Hi, I'm Simon Caplan, the Director of Jewish Education for the Pincus Fund, and here with Nic Abery and Yechiel Hoffman to have a conversation focusing on re-envisioning the Jewish day school. That's our aim, to focus on that. Just to introduce you to Nic and Yechiel. Nic is the primary schools project advisor for the Partnership of Jewish Schools in the UK, PAJES, and an educational consultant for Educating for Impact, EFI, in Europe. And she specializes in the integration of Jewish studies and general studies through the exploration of museum art, objects, and culture. And she has more than 20 years experience in school education and Jewish education in UK, Europe, and Israel. And she tells me that when she's not discussing education and pedagogy, she can be found pounding the streets of North London, visiting museums and galleries. Yechiel, Rabbi Yechiel Hoffman, is the US Director of Jewish Interactive. He's enriched Jewish journeys of children and adults in Jewish day schools and community organizations and synagogues. After an early career in the entertainment industry, Yechiel received the prestigious Pomegranate Prize from the Covenant Foundation, earned a doctorate in education from Northeastern University, and he is the co-founder of JEDLab. So hi, both of you.
Hello.
Okay, so listen, a starter question just to get us going. I'll throw this out to you, Nic. You know, although what we hope we're going to talk about is the day after tomorrow, the long-term re-envisioning of what Jewish education and particularly the day school is going to be like. But at the end of the day, you know, our clients, as it were, are the kids, the students. And there's no doubt that this pandemic is having a dramatic effect on everything, but not least the relationship between children and Jewish education, children and their parents, the home. And I know that you've dealt with a lot of teachers and a lot of schools during this period. So, you know, what's happening in the minds of our kids at the moment?
So I think we have to separate them into sort of sections, because we're actually at a point now where we've got some kids who are actually physically back in school and some at home. So up until that point, I think the mental health, I mean, I can speak for myself, there were good days and bad days, and I think that's the same with all kids. I think the stress for parents was considerable, and the stress for kids. We've had to kind of get to grips with a new normal, and we've had to also understand that checking in mentally is really important. How are you doing today? You know, have you been outside? Have you spent some time checking in with friends? I think that people, parents, kids, adults, teachers have had to reinvigorate what would be a normal interaction between peers, right? One of the things that we sort of forget about the school life is that it's not just about academics, right? It's where kids connect. It's where kids learn social skills. It's where you learn boundaries. It's where you deal with conflict resolution and so forth. And when you remove that from the equation, it's really difficult, because you have to reignite it. We're relying on social media, we're relying on Zoom, friendships over Zoom. It's really difficult. How do you read people? How do you understand body language? I think now, when some kids are back at school, some kids aren't, again, we're in a situation where we're having to take into a new normal. There's also huge amounts of fear and uncertainty. And for many children, this is the first time where they are immersed in a situation where there is no clear-cut end, there is no clear-cut resolution. And as much as parents and educators want to say, you know, it's fine, the underlying belief and state is that it may not be fine, and that we may be in this for a long time.
It's a bit frightening, yeah.
Absolutely, and understanding that it's okay to be frightened, and it's okay to feel the uncertainty, and to feel secure in uncertainty, and say, it's all right, we're all in that same situation. And I think lots and lots and lots of communication. And I think now what we're doing, and certainly a piece of work that PAJES has been heavily involved with, is being a piece of educational material to recreate the sense of community in the classroom. and to say, what does our community now look like? What does our school now look like? What does the interactions between peers look like? Because kids in the UK and across Europe have now been split into, say, a class of 30 has now been split into a class of, say, 15, right? So the bubbles, they call them bubbles. I mean, that's exactly what they're called. So now you've gone from, you know, you might not be in a group with all your peers. You might be in a group with, you know, the kid who really rubs you up the wrong way.
And they understand that they're going back to a different set of social circumstances.
And one of the things schools have done immense amounts of work with, they've created videos, they've created Q&A sessions for parents, the teacher has been online with the kids, so there's been a lot of preparation. And then those first few days, we've put in educational provision to actually say, what's going on? You know, how are you feeling? Have you got fears? I mean, I have to say, what's been fantastic is hearing the positive outcomes of returning to school and how happy even our youngest students are. That doesn't detract from the sense. Well, also we've got lots of kids who are still at home.
Yeah.
Right. We've only got 3 classes in the UK. We've got 3 grades who are back in school, and the same with Germany, and the same, you know, they're on rotation systems. You've got some kids going in the morning, some kids going in the afternoon, and everything that goes with it. So you're right.
Sorry, Nick. Yechiel, what's happening at your end? Where are we at vis-a-vis the children?
So it's really
West
interesting.
Coast.
Thinking about like the United States, right now most schools are actually ending their school year and have not returned back to school, and so it's more about anticipating what might happen in the fall and trying to prepare both the teachers and the parents and students for what that might look like, even though there's a tremendous amount of variables right now that are going to affect what that would look like in different schools in different cities and different regions. And then on top of that, it's all the kids are entering into summer period, where summer is now and not going to look like any other summer they did. So they just went through a school period of 3 months that doesn't look anything like they did. And as Nikki really carefully explained, the dynamic between wanting normal and also adapting to a not the same normal. Yeah. Now they get another period of having to adapt again. And I think there's both a sense of, you know, what can we do that still feels like summer, and also just managing a sense of disappointment that the things that they're going to get the chance to do are not going to be the things that they would expect from a summer period. And for some ways, that's a little even more challenging for a child to adapt to than a school that looks different because it's online rather than in person. Right. Particularly because of the social elements. There's a lot of ways that kids look forward to the summer to connect with people they don't normally connect with during the school year, or to be able to have environments in which they can really form relationships. And with that gone, there's a resistance to using the summer period to do things that look like what they just did in the school year period.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, it links immediately to a very long-term question. What is school going to look like? I mean, from what we know today, what is the structure of the school next year, the year after that?
I mean, I can start a little bit with what's happened both in Europe, in some of the cities that I have connections with, and also in England. So if we start with Scandinavia, because they were that whole region was one of the first to actually send the kids back. So most grades are split. So you have elementary younger years attending in the morning, a mass cleaning that takes place around lunchtime, and then upper grades in the afternoon.
Right. In the same numbers in the classroom.
So it happens to be that the large numbers of Scandinavian schools have very small class sizes. It's one of the sort of proponents of the Scandinavian system, right? It's that kind of aspiration of having less than 18, 15 kids. So when you're creating a sort of bubble and all the data says 15 kids from, I don't know where that number from, but 15 kids is this is the bubble. So for example, in Helsinki, they were able to do that. Class sizes are somewhere between 12 and 18. So even 18, they can sort of split. But, what we're talking about there is, kids of younger ages are not used to sitting in old desks, individual desks where you're not you're spaced between, you've got that social distancing of somewhere between 1 meter and 2 meters. Kids can't interact with each other in the playground. lunchrooms are separated, so every third seat can be used. You have to have, you know, clear designated spaces. So that's what sort of Scandinavia. Germany, the school that I have.
What about the places where that's not the case, where there are a huge number of
right? So in England, for example, we have only brought back 3 grades at the moment, right? So over the last 2 weeks, the majority of schools that have opened have brought back reception, which is our youngest year. So those are the kids who are going to be 5. The next grade up, so that's year 1, so the kids who are going to turn 6 or a 6, and then the top grades, the top class, year 6 of elementary. Okay, again, 15 group bubbles, 2 meter spaced, and most schools are working on a 2-day-a-week system. And what I mean by that is the school is open Monday and Tuesday for some of those kids. Wednesday is a full deep clean, and then they're open again Thursday and Friday.
No, to go from the is to the, you know, to the ought. You know, we've had this experience with this period of as much online has been possible, with people scrambling into this in very short term. But now we're looking into a long-term future. So, you know, is the blend that is going to be the, you know, the necessary blend for the immediate, is that a better arrangement for the school? I mean, Yechiel, do you see, you know, how do you see the balance between the online that we've had and the face-to-face that always used to be the case? Are we going to have shorter school days? Are we going to have shorter weeks, as Nic's describing?
I still think the notion of what it's going to be after tomorrow is still very unclear. I think we recognize that this coming school year, which will start in the fall, is not going to start off and look like any other school year. In many ways, it will reflect already the changes that Nic's describing having taken place in some of the schools, whether in the UK or, as she mentioned, in Helsinki, where schools that have large classroom sizes will have to start breaking up into smaller groups and pods. They'll have to restructure their schedule, which means the question of where do they have to hire more teachers. Some schools are considering, if they can't hire more teachers, to doing some actually, like, kids sit in one room with a Zoom and the teachers in the other room. But most of these are like technical adaptations to the realities that are being placed on them by.
That's what I'm asking. Never mind the realities. What is a better arrangement for schooling?
From what I found, most of the schools have not really started thinking about, oh wow, what does this opportunity allow us to do to open up to thinking about better education? Because they're still trying to navigate the realities of what it means to even serve education. However, what I've heard from some of the schools that I've worked with and some of the school leaders is that the schools that are already were thinking about how do we do better progressive education, those are the ones that are going to be pushing it forward, not because they're seeing this as a new opportunity. It's just they always think with any change they make, what's this doing according to our larger model? So, for example, there are many schools that have always thought about doing multi-grade level leveling for certain things like Hebrew. And this is now giving them an opportunity to actually execute that, because since they're already breaking kids into pods for some things, now it's not about, you know, a kid who's 7 years old, a kid who's 9-year-old is more, you know, contagious than the other. So it's like, we can't mix them. They can mix in any way. So they're starting to think, like, what's the things we do? I think the other area that's going to be really impacted, and Nic kind of mentioned it in her, like, in the area in her bio, which is the question of integration. A lot of ways that we have structured schools right now is actually by curriculum, which is a parallel curriculum between Judaics and general studies. And most grade levels is actually like separated. You don't mix your science study with your teaching of kids how to read. What we're now seeing because of this dynamics is a lot of schools are thinking about, how do I integrate actually these subjects together, because I might have less time with students in person. So I want to integrate.
It's the time element that you think is going to, you know.
The time element, and that's where we'll also open up opportunities for more, let's say, hybrid learning rather than full distance learning, because what schools are realizing is if we have tools that can individualize learning, and some of that learning does not have to happen on site with a teacher, we can figure out which things can get chunked to happen, let's say, at home on their own, and which things have to happen in a school. And to just go to Nic's point earlier, it's the social emotional well-being is really on the top of the mind of most school leaders. They're really thinking about how do we maximize school time to address those issues, and what academic things can we now allow kids to do through technology and online, using online resources when they're not directly with the teacher.
Right, yeah. I just, one of the other things I will add is that it really feels that there's going to be a 3-part educational system. So you'll have kids in the classroom, kids at home, and then some kids who are somewhere between the two. So this blended system, hybrid system, which is pedagogically a completely new area, right? We're not talking about the online, academics world, right? So there's been institutions that have been doing online degrees for years and years and years, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about young kids. We're talking about pedagogy. We're talking about teacher training. We're talking about the capacity. You've got some teachers who kind of feel very comfortable about putting lessons together via, all different apps. Yeah. And then you've got something that is terrifying for. And I think,
although don't you think that that one of the things that's happened here is not that there's new technology, but that the comfort level of educators to use it, force majeure, they've had to. Don't you think the comfort level has gone up?
I think so. I think there are two. It's really interesting. People fall in sort of 2 categories. You can't get away from having that desire to want to be with children. You don't go into teaching without a desire to actually spend time and days with kids. And then when that is forced upon you, where you can't be in there, you have to try and find a way to maintain those integral conversations and contact points. I think the other thing that's really interesting is, and we know this, is that you get Zoom fatigue. Right. And so what you want to find a way is a balancing so that kids actually, and I don't know about you, but I don't get that much done when I'm physically on Zoom. I get a lot more done before or after I have to do a Zoom call. So actually it's also getting into the kids understanding that some of their academic time is where you would have been in the classroom and the teacher would have said, okay, you're now going to do a task. Your discussion time would be via Zoom, and then your independent tasks. It's a lot about independence, and building independent skills into the kids' capabilities on a day-to-day basis, whether they're in the classroom, via computer, or at home.
Now, a new actor, in a sense, in general terms, has entered into this piece, which is the parent. Schools, in many ways, Jewish day schools were a kind of recognizing the lack of capacity of the home to create a Jewish identity, build a Jewish identity for kids. Now, in a sense, the emphasis has switched back to the home. Parents have been faced with at least entertaining, if not educating their kids. I mean, do you think there's a lasting impact there? And is that part, where does that fit into the sort of educational recipe of the school? And what does that say about teachers as well?
Well, I think one thing that we've noticed is that there are 2 types of roles that parents are being put into, and it also reflects to what Nick was saying about the different types of teachers that are out there and the relationship to teaching through technology. When a teacher is mostly setting up the student's experience to be through Zoom, and it's mostly going to be somewhat the same, the parent kind of becomes a navigator, where it's like, oh, they're responsible for keeping the schedule and getting the kid on and off the Zoom at the right time. And that can be a very challenging thing for a parent to do, especially while they're trying to do all their own responsibilities. Mm-hmm. The other type, which is not any less challenging, which is the teacher who's looking to empower the student to engage in more personalized and individualized learning. And in some ways, the parent is not becoming the navigator anymore. They're becoming actually a facilitator of that learning. They're having to be engaged in talking to their students about their children, what they're doing, helping them think through some of the things that they're learning, helping them troubleshoot when they're presented with challenges. And both are roles that parents are not necessarily used to playing. I think we have to think about it for the future of which role is actually helpful for the child's overall learning progress, for the student, for their own parent to play with them in that role. They are so used to teachers playing both their roles for them. And suddenly your parent, which you want to have one type of relationship with, is now playing a role in your life as an educator would have. And do we want a parent to just be able to help the kid get from here to there? Or do we want a parent to be immersed in the student's learning? And how can we support parents in whichever role we're asking them to play.
Right. Well, that's it. There's a question of, will parents rebel? once they can get the kids out of the house, will they rebel? That this was a short-term thing. We respect teachers more, but we don't want to play a role in the kids' education. Or do you think this is an experience that maybe will open the door to more of a triangulated type of education?
So I just want to give a fascinating scenario that we've encountered, and I go back to Helsinki because I have a very strong personal and professional connection with them. So again, the Scandinavian model, a bit like the Israeli model to a certain extent, is that kids travel to school completely independently from age 7. Parents really aren't involved in their kids' education apart from sort of, their end of year academic achievement, an assembly or invited for certain things. As a result of the kids being at home, parents have become a total stakeholder in their children's education. They're so much more involved, and Jewishly, it's had a huge impact because suddenly the kids are displaying and showing their parents what they've been learning at school, because the learning is taking place on the kitchen table. And the lessons are taking place on the kitchen table. And maybe everybody's sitting around the kitchen table with their own devices and their own earphones, and they're all doing their own thing. And
do you think there's a chance that can be maintained?
I think that what's fascinating is that we've had conversations about absolutely maintaining that and bringing parents much more into the forefront of their children's educational experience and saying, right, we need to monopolize on this because this is pure gold. Because what we've suddenly got here is we've got a targeted audience that we know we've needed to tap into, right? Who will have already got a vested interest. They've been part and parcel of their children's education. So we've already put, for example, a date in the first 2 weeks of the academic year in Helsinki going back to invite parents to be part of their educational experience. And if they can't physically come in, we'll do some sort of hybrid learning experience. Right. And we're doing a family week. Right, so let's get those parents to have a vested interest. We also have seen, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, the number of adults participating in adult education and Jewish events online has shot through the roof. Yeah. The numbers who are attending limuds and attending Tikkun Leil Shavuot that went all the way through the week before, and cultural events and discussions, it's completely mushroomed. And that again is, let's keep that going. Let's keep those dialogues. By the way, it's much easier to click on your computer than get a babysitter and go out for the evening and have an event. Much easier to do it in your own home.
Absolutely. And increased work from home will continue to allow many adults to have actually more time, even with all the other constraints than they had before. So there's no doubt that is a phenomenon. So there are now, in a sense, this sometimes tragic and certainly very difficult, I think, has spawned two resources to the day school. One being, say, increasing the comfort level with technology. There's a question of, is the technology there, or what do we need, for the longer term? I think that's a question to be asked. But also it's introduced this other thing. And now, so then, I'd like to kind of get your take on what that means for the educator, because the educator now is also, in a sense, playing with more different resources and more resources than they had before. So what does the educator need to have in their kit bag in order to mobilize, sort of activate these very important extra resources? Yechiel, do you want to?
Yeah, one of the things I'm thinking about in terms of that question is actually the different layers of types of educators that exist within our systems. And for the most part, just thinking about the examples that Nic just gave about what they're foreseeing in Helsinki, that wasn't necessarily the domain of the teacher to think about, like, how do you bring parents into larger conversation, how do you bring families? And one of the things that I've noticed over the past 3 months is how many more teachers had to start navigating and thinking about what their interactions were like with parents. That it wasn't just like I'll meet with you 3 months into the term to talk about, report cards, but now they were like, oh, how do I have to navigate explaining to you how to engage your child in a learning or using a technology or developing a new skill? So I think one of the biggest changes we're seeing and developing is the ways in which teachers are thinking about how they use parents as part of the education process, and not just relying on, let's say, a principal or a school leader to think about how that's going to happen.
Right, but you see, it also something like that, is a skill. I mean, it's a professional skill as well. So I've said before, I don't know a teacher training program and accreditation that actually makes the teacher an expert in working with this resource.
So working with parents is, first of all, understanding the parents and being able to build empathy with the parent experience, but also learning how to teach parents. So we talk about parent education is usually the education of parents of how to parent, but actually we're talking about that has to be expanded about how to learn and to teach adults how to be part of the educational process. The other way is really helping teachers think about pedagogy differently. So we introduced a lot of new technology, and it was kind of like it was slammed on the brakes, and like we threw a lot of technology at them. One of the things that has to happen in the next few months is really start to think about the different pedagogies they could use when they are using technology or when they are taking a student-centered approach to learning. Those are two things that some teachers already have some facility with, but for most teachers, they have not gotten training around. They've gotten exposure maybe. And what we really need to do is take the time to really help them think on both levels, the technology level and the student-centered learning level, and how to really be prepared to do that in this coming year, rather than just like backing into it because an emergency happens.
Right. Well, so okay, you mentioned the technology. What about the technology then? I mean, this one of the things that this period has been like a laboratory. If you say the teachers have been thrown in, everybody's been thrown into the situation and has scrambled to make the best of it. And there's no doubt it's increased the use of technology and comfort with the use of technology. But has it actually also taught us, what is not there that should be there? What is there that really has worked and should be developed further? What about?
I think unfortunately we've been stuck also in a period of divisions, and I'm very conscious that we have a tendency to club sort of our Jewish kids all in one group and sort of presume that they're kind of middle class. They've got the technology, they've got the Wi-Fi, they've got the broadband, they've got the devices, and actually that's just not necessarily true. I mean, my own children's school was very aware of, and my kids are both in secondary school. I've got a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old. And as a parent, we were told by the school that if you didn't have a device, please contact the school, and the school would ensure that their devices that they have available will be brought to the students in order to ensure that the students can access the hardware, forget the software. Right, so that's the first thing, right? You have to rely upon the fact that every child is going to have access, and that's when synchronistic learning becomes very complicated, right? Synchronistic being the live lessons, right? That relies upon every child in that household to have a device at that time and be available, right? So that's the first thing. That's before we even think about the know-how of a teacher. Right, and the teachers, do the teachers all have their devices? Are they at home with small kids? I mean, it's just a minefield of issues. I do feel that there has been, and there is ongoing, I feel like this summer is going to be the sort of summer of professional development, right? I feel like lots and lots and lots of people, just even trawling today through some various websites looking for some resources for people. I mean, just the plethora of organizations that are beginning to put out blended learning and virtual learning resources, because actually we had to do it blind at the beginning, and now they're like, okay, well, we can pause the button a little bit, start the summer with some professional development as a team, as a cohort, whole faculties training, and seeing what works and what doesn't work. I think that's the other thing, that people are very aware that there are certain apps, certain platforms, certain resources that are fantastic, and others that just don't work in certain grades, and you have to sort of be able to differentiate it. I mean, if somebody wants to do a PhD and do some serious pieces of research, I mean, I think this is the time to do it. because it's all new. It's all new, and it's, you know, and I don't think anything, I mean, there are some tried and tested, but I think overall, I think the other thing is that kids we know, especially the younger ages, and this is sort of my background, they still need the physicality of actually doing things, right? You know, you can't really learn about, you know, mini beasts, as in digging up, you know, worms and bugs in the garden from looking on a computer screen. So there has to be a balance.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, Yechiel, like, it's really interesting because obviously I'd love to, I mean, I know quite a lot about sort of some of the work that Jewish Interactive is doing, and the balance that you're seeing also in the States. And the reason I say that is that we're still in the midst of school. And I know some of the teachers in the States are already beginning to have, because they're having the vacation, like, do you see training? Are you seeing like training programs?
Definite training. We're not going to see it really come till August because teachers are very overwhelmed and exhausted at this point. Even the schools who would usually do an end of the year training just in general on an annual basis didn't do theirs this year, kind of let their teachers kind of like unwind and unpack and then like collapse. I think some teachers are doing their own individualized kind of like preparation, recognizing here's the things I need to do to, let's say, prepare my curriculum to be more accessible digitally, to be more familiar with the various tools that are out there so I can adapt my curriculum. I think they're thinking about that. But there's so much of an energy right now on the restructuring that has to happen for this coming year that there hasn't been a lot of figuring out exactly what training we need to do.
But to my, I think I'd like to sort of focus you on this issue of the support agencies, because we're talking about, you know, the more macro issues. Really, what everything's been do it yourself. The individual school, the individual teacher. Nic is in an organisation, PAJES, that has got a franchise or a remit to work across the system. But in general, this is something that is, you know, put off to the local level. It seems to me that there's going to be a real need for really powerful, well-resourced central agencies in education, both because of professional development, those issues, and also because of, in a sense, I don't want to call it quality control, but you mentioned, Nic, the plethora of resources. The question is, you know, of that plethora of resources, are the best resources getting into the whole system? And that seems to me that that's partly a role for central agencies to make sure that happens. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, go on.
Sorry.
After you.
No, I was going to say, I think there's multiple roles that those agencies are playing. One they've already been doing, which is being able to gather, like Nic said, those resources and to be able to share them broadly as they get them. That was done kind of like with the level of urgency, and now it's happening with the level of intention. I think the other way is they're starting to have the opportunity to train what I would say are like the master teachers, and to really take the people they already have relationships with and really help prepare them to be exemplars of what things are going to look like, and to hopefully kind of like set them up to be able to spread around different ways of doing things that they couldn't just reach out to every educator in every school to do. And the third is, I think there's a lot of advocacy work that needs to go on to step beyond the technical changes that need to be made, but to really think about the big pictures, because most school leaders just don't have the bandwidth right now to be asking those big questions or to really take the time. And these agencies have the ability from their position a little bit outside of the system to be able to see what's happening and advocate. Here are the big changes you need to make. You know, I know, Nic, that you're involved in several of those efforts to think about what those could be.
I mean, PAJES, this is a fascinating situation. So when we went into lockdown, we put very, very quickly 2 websites together. One which was support for educators, which had a whole plethora of resources and websites. JedLab was on there, JI was on there, various other organizations were on there. You know, we also did it for parents, right? So we were tapping into what could parents do with their kids from Joe Wicks, who's this sort of national phenomenon doing PE, he's the national PE teacher in England, right? To cookery classes online, to well-being sessions, right? So that's how we started off. But what was fascinating is we also put networks together. So we've, in the last 3 months, had groups of elementary, high school, and all head teachers discussing and raising issues together. In preparation for school opening, we had 3 sessions, 2 with a leading pediatric and adolescent psychiatrist to talk about well-being and how to support the kids going back into school, and also with medical professionals, literally talking through all the answers and questions and issues that have raised about the security, the safety that we could provide, that's sort of actually giving know-how. We're in contact with the DFE, the governmental body in terms of educating the country, and it's sort of the main department that deals with school opening and education in the UK. And PAJES has been in the forefront of having to provide that. I mean, they've even talked about procurement of PPE, because if you're dealing with very young children, PPE is, actually access to it. I mean, it's just, if you think about it, this is not the area that any head teacher, any school leader had even an iota of an idea they would have to deal with when they started the academic year in September. But what it does show, and I think Yechiel's mentioned this, is there's also huge amounts of need for collaboration. And that I
think one of the interesting, I don't know whether it's an irony of the situation, is that in separating off everybody into their own isolated slots, it's on all sorts of levels brought out, in a sense, a will towards forms of togetherness, be they, which you can see actually in what's happening in the United States at the moment with the the Black Lives Matter stuff that's going on at the moment, but also in terms of the community and in terms of collaboration. And in a way, I think that's something that's could easily come out of this with a very lasting effect. The understanding of the need, not for the physical socialness, but for actual real. So I don't know how to.
Sense of community. I think it's a sense of community. I think the school community has grown, right? So teachers had always had some sort of level of collaboration, certainly within a staff, and you'd had groups, right? So we had networks of head teachers or networks of heads of Judaic studies. Now what you're seeing is that everybody's, the playing field is flat, right? And somebody has a question, they post it on this WhatsApp group, and this sort of backwards and forwards of support for each other. I mean, to the extent that school numbers in terms of like applications have, there's still unsecured numbers of like how many places schools have had. So there'll be a WhatsApp group message that says, does anybody have a space for an 8-year-old child for September? Right. Yeah, that just would never have happened, because there would always be some sort of level of competition. That's just gone. It's
gone, yeah. Another aspect, Yechiel, that when we were talking before this, that you mentioned, which I think goes along the same lines, is the issue of the de-siloing issue. In other words, the separation has always been between the formal education system, camps, youth movements, and you had said to me, perhaps you could just speak to that a little bit, about both the need and the opportunity for a more integrated approach to Jewish education, which de-silos, as you put it before.
It's operating on a few levels. 2 that I think are important for our conversation is, 1, the nature of like our global Jewish world is getting flattened. Like what's happening in Israel is affecting the United States, it's affecting the UK, it's affecting everywhere. One particular way we've seen that happen actually is in this summer, is when usually hundreds or thousands of shluchim come out of Israel and spread themselves around the world, and weren't able to this year, which then immediately affected what kind of programs people could operate this year. And immediately started seeing a turnover where, because Israel opened up earlier, they were already thinking about things in a different way. And they started thinking creatively about like, what do we do this summer for all these kids? And it allowed Israel to actually lead the American system to think about what tools, what models they were going to set up. And you wouldn't normally see that happening. You'd see that happening as like, oh, we share resources maybe, but we operate separately. And we've been able to see that sharing happen as you thought about that. On the other level is because everybody suddenly was in this moment of isolation in which they were not able to organize the way they could, everybody had to start thinking, whether it was the youth groups, whether it was the supplementary schools, whether it's the day schools, whether it's the synagogues, everybody had to start thinking together of how do we connect with people. And it suddenly became like, oh, just because I'm in a school and I deal with academics, I don't have to think about what you as a youth group do. It was, what do we learn from each other about how we can now use these new environments and how we can collaborate better? And you can see it flatten. And one example, many examples have happened in the adult learning world. As mentioned before, we saw that tremendously during Pesach and like the lead up to Shavuot, but it's happening all the time within the youth-centric world. And I think we're starting to see, particularly in the summertime, a greater deal of collaboration where organizations that never served youth groups, but maybe were just focused on their own programs or serving schools, are suddenly offering their services to camps and to think about how do you do an online program, or how do you do a day camp program with smaller amount of kids, or how do you bring kids into nature. And that
I think we're creating quite a rosy picture of the possibilities here, because we talked about the new or now available resources of the technology, the available resources of the family and the parents, and here's another resource, which is the cross-fertilization of the different parts of the system.
And I go back to what Nick said about the schools and their willingness to share right now, and to maybe let go of a little bit of the competitiveness or the territorialism that sometimes is a part of our system. You could say that's a reaction to our moment, the level of crisis, the level of the economy breaking down. But I think it's also when we are all feeling a sense of vulnerability, we are much more open to rethinking some of the boundaries that we create for ourselves that are actually not organic to our systems. And going back to the larger question, I think it is up to leaders that are not embedded within those individual organizations, but are part of organizations that help uphold the ecosystem, to actually intentionally encourage that to continue as a behavior. That this openness and collaboration shouldn't go away as more schools find themselves operating as usual, but rather to say, look what's possible now within our system. Look how many more people are being impacted. Look how many more connections are being made. And that's where the real work is going to be for most of us who don't work in those specific sites to do over the next year as things could become a new normal.
Yeah. I wish we could go on much longer, but I think we absolutely have to draw this to a close. I just want to read you a quote I saw the other day. The pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. That's from the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab. One thing everybody agrees is this is a crisis, has been a crisis. So we're all in a crisis. The classic definition of crisis is a combination of danger on the one hand and opportunity on the other. So perhaps just to close, I wonder if each of you could give us your, off the top of your head, sense of what is one big danger that's facing us, and what is the greatest or one of the great opportunities that is facing us. Yechiel, do you want to go first with that?
Sure. I'm actually thinking about this week's Parsha a lot within this context. This week's Parsha is Parshat Shlach, which is the story of the spies. And I think in many ways that story epitomizes both the danger and the opportunity we have right now. I mean, we find the Israelites in the desert. They've been there not very long time, just a year or two, and they're finding their ways and navigating around. They built some structures for their lives. They've actually gotten to be a little comfortable. But when they first get a glimpse of the aspirational future, and it looks kind of scary to them, a big reaction from those spies and most of the people is, let's go back to Egypt. Not let's just even stay in the comfort, but let's go back to even the normal before that we know wasn't good enough for us, because that will give us a sense of we have an awareness of what we're up against. And there are two spies that see that world and see the aspiration. They see it as opportunity, not a challenge. And they say there might be giants there. There might be, grasshoppers and huge fruit that we don't know what to deal with. But what we see is an opportunity to take everything we've learned so far in this desert and to make this next promised land something that is attainable. And I think that's the aspiration. That's the challenge is, don't just slide back to what we know was comfortable, but actually to see the promise even when it looks scary.
Great. Brilliant. Nic, do you want to?
So I'm actually going to nab on and continue that. And I think there's two areas as well that this week's Parsha reflects on. And one is also about the way we describe something, right? So I agree, right? This is a crisis. However, crises are opportunities that are waiting to happen as well. And it's about how we describe that crisis and how we embody that crisis. We could just say, we're going to go back, not just to an old education system, but we're not actually going to use this as an opportunity to rethink what didn't work, right? And actually look forward to what could be much more effective. I mean, certainly in the education system in the UK, there are so many aspects of it that are old, outdated, just desperately in need of an overhaul. And so I see this, and from a Jewish education perspective as well, like what hasn't worked, what can we use as an opportunity of really regaining and gaining skills and opportunities of learning. So I think that's the first one. The second one is about this optimism, is seeing that, there are pioneers, those two spies were the pioneers, if you like, right? Who are the educators? Who are the unsung educators in our schools who have really championed new pedagogies, new levels, have made connections, the pioneers who've also kind of gone above and beyond, who are just your bog standard teacher, who really, should be raised on a level of training and opportunity. And I think that's the other side of it. So I see it's not just about looking backwards, it's also about saying, okay, what didn't work? Let's really get rid of that, and let's really use this as an opportunity, strategically as well, and really thinking about this generation. Because I think the other thing is, everyone's like, oh my goodness, these children will have lost out. Well, the other way of looking at it is, you know what, some of these kids are going to come out with much better life skills. My kids can make a bed, right? My kids know how to cook lunch. That's not a bad thing, right? Those are fabulous life skills, right? And the Jewishly as well. What outcomes? My kids understand how important it is that we live in a neighborhood and we have neighbors that we need to look after. If that isn't solid education, then I don't know what is.
I totally agree with you. We shouldn't look at this as a wasted time. It's actually been a very difficult but fertile time on so many different levels. I think we should come back in a year's time and revisit this conversation and see how much of it actually makes sense, if not how much of it is actually now being put into practice. But
I have one request. Can we do it in person?
Oh, that would be
come on, right?
West Coast or London or Israel. You choose.
Depends the time of year.
I really want to thank both of you for giving this time, and the conversations to be continued. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been really fun.
Thanks.